Well, good evening. I hope everybody is well. To start out Friday's lesson, I would like to read a chapter from N.T. Wright's book, For All God's Worth. And this chapter is about worship, and I will read it in its entirety. What is the most beautiful thing you have experienced this week? Maybe something you heard, maybe some beautiful music, perhaps in church or in a cathedral. Maybe something you saw in the world of nature, the sun breaking through the mist and making the autumn leaves luminous. The curl of a squirrel's tail as he sat nibbling a nut. It might be something you smelled, the scent of a rose, perhaps, or the smell of a good meal cooking when you were very hungry. It might be something you tasted, a special cheese, that same meal well seasoned and well cooked. Maybe something you experienced in work, things suddenly coming together, an unexpected new opportunity. It might be something you experience in human relationships, a quiet, gentle glance from someone you love dearly, the soft squeeze of a child's hand. Hold that moment in your mind and ask yourself, what does this beauty do to you? It enriches you, yes. It warms you inside, yes. It makes you more alive, yes. It makes you stronger, yes. It makes you perhaps a little humble. You didn't cause this beauty, you didn't make it, it just happened and happened to you, yes. And what does this beauty call out from you? Gratitude, of course. Delight, yes. Naturally, a sense of awe. Well, perhaps a sense of longing for something beyond. Something just out of reach. Quite possibly, though, if your experience of beauty was the smell of a good meal, I hope it didn't stay out of reach for too long. What about worship? Does beauty call out worship from you? We don't very often use the word worship to describe our attitude to things or people other than God Himself. Almost the only place we come across it is in the marriage of service in the Book of Common Prayer, where, to my mind, utterly appropriately, the man declares to the woman, "With my body I thee worship." Of course, there are good biblical injunctions not to worship, in the fullest sense, anything or anyone except God Himself. But the word worship means literally worth ship. To accord worth, true value to something. To recognize and respect it for the true worth it has. And that sets us on a trail that leads us from the squirrel in the garden, the steak in the oven, the singing in the choir, and the squeeze of the hand, all the way to the one who created all of them in the first place. I want to speak about worship, and that means that I want to talk about God and about the beauty of God. If we are to worship God truly, it is not enough to think of God's greatness and majesty, His power and sovereignty, His holiness and absolute otherness. That's all enormously important as part of the story. But we wouldn't ordinarily use the word beauty to refer to any of that. I want to suggest to you in this chapter that our ordinary experiences of beauty are given to us to provide a clue, a starting point, a signpost, from which we move on to recognize, to glimpse, to be overwhelmed by, to adore, and so to worship, not just the majesty, but the beauty of God Himself. And just as we don't very often use the word worship in connection with beauty in the natural world, so we don't very often use the word beauty in connection with God. That is our loss. And I suggest we are set about making it good. Why do I want to talk about worship? Two reasons stand out. First, there are some central passages in Scripture which speak of our citizenship in heaven, and which speak of it not least as a constant and delighted experience of worship. The great multitude in Revelation, which no man can number, aren't playing cricket. They aren't going shopping. They are worshiping. Excuse me. Sounds boring. If so, it shows how impoverished our idea of worship has become. At the center of that worship stands a passage like Isaiah 33. Your eyes will see the King in his beauty. The Lord is our judge. The Lord is our ruler. The Lord is our King. He will save us. Worship is the central characteristic of the heavenly life. And that worship is focused on the God we know in and as Jesus. The second reason I want to talk about worship is that it forms the central tasks of the church, not least of a cathedral. The Archbishops of Canterbury and York recently commissioned a report on English cathedrals, which was published in 1994 under the title Heritage and Renewal. The report covers many different aspects of the life of cathedrals. Whatever one thinks of the details in various places, there is, right at the center, something they got gloriously right. The report states unequivocally and emphatically that the purpose of a cathedral, and this would of course apply to any church anywhere, is worship and mission. These two, it emphasizes, belong inextricably together with management, which it calls governments, as a vital means of enabling and sustaining that worship and mission. There is unanimity, they say, about the priority of worship in the function of cathedrals. These great buildings are descriptions of the majesty of God, places of living faith. The Commission stresses that at the center of all mission opportunities and management requirements, the primary emphasis is on worship as the maintenance of a daily witness of the sovereignty of God in the world. This is linked directly to the cathedral's role in society and always has a missionary reference. In giving glory to God, the primary purpose of worship those present may be enabled to catch a glimpse of that glory. Daily cathedral worship has been the central pillar of the Church's prayer and praise down the centuries. The spiritual heartbeat not only of the cathedral, but of the diocese, the community, and the nation. Indeed, it is the worship of God that prevents these buildings becoming mere theme parks or museums. Without the warming fire of worship, says the Commission, in summing up the end of the report, these elegant buildings would be ancient monuments rather than living temples capable of inspiring the souls of men and women with glimpses of the divine. It is right, therefore, that from time to time the Church should take stock of that which is most central, most important, most vital in our common life together. Though we sing with the tongues of men and of angels, if we are not truly worshiping the living God, we are noisy gongs and clanging cymbals. Though we organize liturgy most beautifully, if it does not enable us to worship the living God, we are mere ballet dancers. Though we repave the floor and reface the stonework, though we balance our budgets and attract all the tourists, if we are not worshiping God, we are nothing. Worship is humble and glad. Worship forgets itself in remembering God. Worship celebrates the truth as God's truth, not its own. True worship doesn't put on a show or make a fuss. True worship isn't focused, isn't half-hearted, doesn't keep looking at its watch. Isn't forced, isn't half-hearted, doesn't keep looking at its watch, doesn't worry about that the person in the next pew may doing. True worship is open to God, adoring God, waiting for God, trusting God even in the dark. Worship will never end. Whether there be buildings, they will crumble. Whether there be committees, they will fall asleep. Whether there be budgets, they will add up to nothing. For we build for the present age, we discuss for the present age, and we pay for the present age. But when the age to come is here, the present age will be done away. For now we see the beauty of God through a glass, darkly, but then face to face. Now we appreciate only part, but then we shall affirm and appreciate God, even as the living God has affirmed and appreciated us. So now our tasks are worship, mission, and management. These three, but the greatest of these is worship. And do you see why it's so easy to create that something like that right there, of 1 Corinthians 13, substituting worship for love. Worship is nothing more nor less than love on its knees before the beloved. Just as mission is love on its feet to serve the beloved, and just as the Eucharist, as the climax of worship, is love embracing the beloved and so being strengthened for service. But this is only true if it's a true God you're worshiping. I was talking to somebody long ago who said, I used to believe in God. But then as I grew up, I found it harder and harder to think of this old man up there in the sky, so far removed from all the pain and suffering down here in the world. And I said to him, I don't believe in that God either. The God I believe in is the God I see in the middle of the pain and the suffering down here in the world. Without Jesus, the crucified Jesus, sharing and bearing the pain and sin and suffering of the world, I don't actually know who on earth or in heaven God might be at all. You see, if you envisage a God up there in the sky, detached from the reality of the world, any worship you offer will simply be a distant acknowledgement of majesty, like the plowboy doffing his cap as the great nobleman rides by ignoring him. And if you go the other route, as my friend was inclined to, and say that therefore the word God can only refer to the impulse of goodness inside ourselves, then you'll find it pretty hard to sustain any real sense of worship at all. All you're left with is the plowboy imagining himself to be a nobleman. But if Jesus is to be the lens through which we glimpse the beauty of God, you will discover what it means to worship, because you will discover what it means to be loved. Put it this way, if your idea of God, if your idea of the salvation offered in Christ is vague or remote, your idea of worship will be fuzzy and ill-formed. The closer you get to the truth, the clearer becomes the beauty, and the more you will find worship welling up within you. That's why theology and worship belong together. The one isn't just a head trip, the other isn't just emotion. I recently read a remarkable testimony to this fact from a man called Jason Richards, who at the time was in Parkhurst prison serving a life sentence for murder. This is some of what had been said. I hadn't been long in my sentence and I was very confused. I was carrying an awful lot of guilt. I was looking for answers. I read a lot. I read Buddhism. I read Islam. I started reading the Bible, and the more I read the scriptures, the more I became aware of God. I don't believe in God. I was actually an atheist, or at least I thought I was, but I came to believe that God existed. And the more I became aware of God, the more I became aware that I was a sinner, and I got more and more desperate. Then one night, I opened the Bible at the very first Psalm. I started reading, and when I got to Psalms 50 and 51, I realized that God would forgive me. I didn't know why Psalm 51 had been written then, but the thing I knew was, save me from blood guilt, O God, the God who saves me, and my tongue will sing of your righteousness. I knew that God could forgive me. I didn't know anything about Jesus or the Bible or the church, I just knew. I read all the rest of the Psalms on my knees, and almost from that point for me, they became psalms of praise. It was like I was beginning to worship, and I didn't know what worship was. From one point of view, that last sentence is no doubt true. He didn't know the dictionary definition of worship. He probably didn't even use the word itself. But I think he did know what worship was. Because I think he had met the living God, the loving God, the beautiful God, the God of whom the psalmist wrote when he said, "One thing have I desired of the Lord that I will require, that I may dwell in the house of the Lord all the days of my life, to behold the fair beauty of the Lord and to visit his temple." The beauty of God is the beauty of love. Love in creation, love in recreation of a world spoiled by sin. It is the same love which is why all the beauty of the world, the beauty that calls forth our admiration, our gratitude, our worship at the earthly level, is meant as a set of hints, of conspiratorial whispers, of clues and suggestions and flickers of light, all nudging us into believing that behind the beautiful word is not random chance but the loving God. He who made the eye, does he not see? He who made the ear, does he not hear? He who created all beauty, is he not himself beautiful? Woe betide those who offer to the creature the worship due to the Creator alone. But woe betide those who fail to read the hints, who fail to hear the subtext, who have the experience but miss the meaning, who are deaf to what may be heard, half heard, in the stillness between two waves of the sea. St. Augustine, in a famous passage, rightly denies that our loves for the material world are the same thing as love for God. He says, our loves for the material world give us both a sign of and the vocabulary for our love for God. And we don't have to apologize for speaking of this love in this way. The world is God's creation, and its beauty is the steady, quizzical pointer to the beauty of God. This is what he wrote. What do I love when I love my God? Not physical beauty or the splendor of time, not the radiance of earthly light so pleasant to our eyes, not the sweet melodies of harmony and song, not the fragrant smell of flowers, perfumes, and spices, not manna or honey, not limbs such as the flesh delights to embrace. These are not the things that I love when I love my God. And yet when I love him, I do indeed love a certain kind of light, a voice, a fragrance, a food, an embrace. But this love takes place in my inner person, where my soul is bathed in light that is not bound by space, when it listens to the sound that time never takes away, when it breathes in a fragrance which no breeze carries away, when it tastes food which no eating can diminish, when it clings to an embrace which is not broken when desire is fulfilled. This is what I love when I love my God. People often quote Oscar Wilde's dictum that a cynic knows the price of everything and the value of nothing. We live in an age of cynics where worth means price, and price means money, and money means power. But the gospel of Jesus Christ puts worth back into the world, worth beyond price, worth beyond worldly power, for the gospel of Jesus Christ summons us to worship, to lay our lives before the one true and living God, to worship him for all he's worth. Give to this great and loving God the honor, the worship, the love due to him. Celebrate the goodness, the worth, the true value of the created order as his gift, his handiwork, and allow that celebration to lift your eyes once more to God himself, to his glory and beauty. This, of course, precisely what we do in the Eucharist, or communion. Symbols of the natural world become vehicles of the heavenly world, of which we are called to be citizens. It is utterly fitting that we should surround and celebrate this moment of intense beauty with carved stone and colored glass, with soaring music and solemn ritual. Worship is what we were made for. Worship is what buildings like churches and cathedrals were made for. If we get this right, we will go to our tasks of mission and management in the right spirit and for the right reason. Worship the Lord in the beauty of holiness. Let the Whole earth stand in awe of him. As people and musicians involved in worship, it's absolutely fundamental that we understand the reason why we are called to worship. And like Wright says in this book, if we don't have an understanding of what we're doing, or even offering up our gifts for the right reason, then we are kind of missing the point, and we start leading others astray or have the potential to do so. What I love about being involved in a worship band, specifically as a lead guitar player, like all you guys are, um, we have great ability to really speak to fellow Christians and others, by appropriate use of our gifts. We can be used by God in a way David was used by God with Saul. First Samuel, one of the out of the three introductions of David when he was a boy, there's this courtyard palace scene, and Saul struggles with evil spirits up until the end of his life. And whenever Saul heard David play, he would be soothed, and his anxiety and the evil spirit would fade away. And I 100% believe that we have that capability to do that for people as well. So many people kind of, if you think about like a Hillsong concert or some of the more flashy worship events, you hear the guitar solos, you hear the lights, or not hear the lights, you see the lights, and this whole scene is painted, and sometimes, and on some levels, rightly so, but we critique those experiences for being manipulative and too emotional. And I do believe there's a point where that happens, but we have to admit that we're taking part in setting up this environment in which proper worship can take place. It's just because of our human nature, it's incredibly difficult to worship God in a setting where everything's trying to take your focus away from who God is and what He's doing. A lot of people complain about crying babies in church, or clothing was not appropriate in church. And those are, on many levels, valid things to say. And there's other distractions that we face too. We're all guilty of this. We get a text message in church, and we go to, pull our phone out of our pocket and see what's up, because we have this need to be constantly connected. That's a distraction in our worship. So it's our responsibility as musicians to create a conducive environment to where we are pointing people to God. And allowing the ability for all these other distractions to disappear. Now, it does take two, but we can play a very critical part in this. Another key thing is a lot of our musicianship and what we choose to do, or the chords that we decide to engage, they can become examples of theology in itself. For example, in every scale, major scale and minor scale, there is this tone called a leading tone. And this leading tone creates tension within the music. So, leading tone creates tension, which wants it to resolve to the root of the scale, or do. Well, there's two chords that we can use that contain that leading tone. The dominant fifth chord and the leading tone 7 chord. Well, we can use those chords to emphasize theological points. For example, Matt Redman's song "Never Once." That last line, "You are faithful, God, you are faithful," that ends on a 5 chord. And the message that's conveying is both the vocal melody and the 5 chord have that leading tone, and that's the last tone of the song. And when you think about it on a deeper level, and we're singing the word faithfulness, and we're having this tone just being sustained that is causing tension and wants to resolve, but it never resolves. Think about what that does to the meaning of the word faithful. When we think about it, God's faithfulness does not resolve. He will always be faithful. There will not be an end. Another example of this usage is another Matt Redman song, "We Could Change the World." And the last line of the song is, "Jesus, in your name, we could change the world." And that's another example of that leading tone sustaining, but taking it in a different context. It's saying, "Jesus, in your name, we could change the world." And it doesn't resolve. This tone is emphasizing that our job as Christians to be representatives of Christ's light in the world never ceases, doesn't resolve until it's the end of our time here. So it's really important as guitar players to be intentional with our melodies, our note choices, our counter melodies, because we're part of a grand picture of this music that's laying this environment to direct people to see God and to recognize God's involvement in their lives. And that's an awesome privilege and a scary privilege. And often I feel that in a lot of churches and worship music today, the seriousness of the task that we're charged with is a little diminished. And that's why I'm talking to you guys about this. So, we really need to be intentional about what we do. I'm going to take several moments. If you want to pause the video to write notes down, this would be a good time to do that. and then I'll go on to my final topic for the lesson. Okay, the final thing I want to touch on, staying in line with being intentional with what we do. Sometimes our choices of how we approach creating lead lines for a song depends on the amount of musicians and what sonic context we have going on. You don't want to be playing like really high notes when you don't have a keyboard player or you don't even have another rhythm guitarist. So it's important that we are aware of who's our team, what do they offer to the table, and how can I choose how I play in the most effective way to create the most conducive environment for worship. So often that will mean if you don't have a rhythm guitar player, you're probably going to need to play more chord based stuff in a lower register, doing things that drive a little bit more. Doesn't mean that you totally have to eliminate the extra melodies you might